This topic is really close to my heart and my research interests in two ways. When we talk about young people, there's always when you talk about young people, it's always in comparison to something else, which is older people. That's not old people. But so it's very important to keep in mind that whenever we talk about young people, that this is a construction of a certain group of users of technology, that it's related to how we think about that group. And often when we do research about it, or when we talk about it, it's as if we're talking about something that is very far removed. We construct an idea of what young people are, as if we were never young, and we don't really know who they are, like they're a little bit of alien. So that whole idea of construction, of an image that we create about who uses technology, and what they do with it, and what it means to them, that is really important for me. Because that influences how we and the people that we're talking about actually use this technology. And I'll talk today a little bit about why this is so important and so vital when we think about social media. Because this is an area in which this happens a lot. When we're talking about young people as if they come from a different planet, as if they're having experiences that are alien to all of us. So that's some of the things that I will do. And the other reason why it's a topic that is of interest to me, and I'll come back to that while I do the talk, is that a lot of the discussion and a lot of the research that goes on in this area really has to do with online spaces and how welcome people feel. Because social media is about social interaction. It's about who do we include in our conversations, who do we include in our relationships. And with all the talk about technology, sometimes we forget that that is the main reason why we use these technologies. And social exclusion or inclusion, making people feel part of groups, small groups, friendship groups, intimate relationships, that's another really important area of my research. So this is a topic in which I can, let my two of those interests come together in a really neat fashion. So why is it so vital to understand that when we talk about social media in relation to young people, this is about as researchers, as students, as who you are in this room right now, how we think about young people. What do young people mean to us? And social media are really, for most of us in this room, part of our everyday lives now. Yeah? Social media in a broad sense. It's about communication, telephone, the internet, email, up until Twitter, Facebook, all these kinds of other platforms that have more recently come into being. It's very strongly linked to our personal aspirations and concerns. Often when we talk about it, it's based on our own experiences. We all know somebody who sent an email that they should not have sent. Or maybe you friended somebody that afterwards you didn't really want to friend, and now you're with the dilemma, am I going to unfriend them? What is this going to mean? In that very intimate space, it comes very close. So it's very anecdotal. It's very close to our hearts. But also professionally, more and more, this is what our professional relationships are built around, about communication through technologies. And because we're really talking about ourselves and what we hope, to be happy people with lots of friends and good work relationships, but also the things that worry us, these kind of not being part of that society. This is where we link it to youth. Because if you look at theories around youth and how we think about young people, we can see that in the way it's theorized, youth are seen to embody the future. That is all those hopes that we have of what we might be, what society might be like, all the possibilities that are out there. Young people are often talked about like that, as kind of a vessel for all the things that we could never do, but they will obviously all be able to do this. And they also make us think about, God, those good old days. Yeah, we look at young people and we say, I remember when I used to play. I used to play outside every day in the lovely sunshine, even though, probably 300 days of the year was raining. But it is that reflection on the past. And it's the kind of fear that society is changing, that the world that we live in right now is not the same anymore. So when we look at social media, we need to realize that we are putting our own hopes and aspirations on these young people that we're talking about, and that some of what we're observing or trying to theorize about is actually more about our personal experiences and what we hope and what we dream for than what is actually going on. So that's when we do research with social media and young people. We need to ask young people, we need to stand next to them, see what they're doing. We need to have their realistic expectations of what is going on. Because otherwise is what we see very often. It happens in the media, but it also happens in academic research. It's what we call these moral media panics, yeah, where people, there is a terrible case, and obviously there's terrible cases. There is kidnapping, there is grooming, there is bullying. These things happen, yeah, and they happen online. But it often gets then taken out of that anecdotal context, which is very close to our hearts, and made it seem as this is something that is now part of everybody's everyday lives. And so, again, instead of looking at what the evidence is out there, we tend to keep falling back on these really strong emotional feelings that come with social media, which has to do with that intimate realm. So there's an abundance of these layman's theories about, you know, the son and the daughter of my neighbor, or my own son and daughter, or my grandparents, or whoever it is that we want to talk about. It's an intuition, an anecdote, and an idealization of face-to-face, as if our face-to-face communication is always positive, always, you know, that we're always nice to each other. We never lie, right? When we're in the same room, I'm never going to lie to you, right? Because there's no medium in between. So there is that idealization of that, which has to do with this kind of image of the past and how we grew up, and the decontextualization. I think that's probably okay. So this is not really helped by a lack of coherent academic theory, because this is an area where people come from all sides and looking at little bits without connecting it all up and thinking about, okay, what can we use to explain this? So I'll try to do a little bit of that in this lecture. How might we think about that? So what is that debate that we are having here? Yeah? These are all the things that you will hear when we talk about social media and youth. There's immigrants, there's natives, yeah, there's people, there's passive, there are victims, they're active, they're doing things to other people because of these media. There's opportunities out there, yeah, the future is in the hand of the youth. We've already missed out on that opportunity in this digital world. There are victims and perpetrators. They're very literate, but there's also a lot of risks that they run into. So there's all these contradictions, and depending on where you are and which venue, which talk you attend, where you go, you can hear just one side of this and forget about everything else that's going on. So again, it's very important that in this we keep that more general picture, and that we actually talk to a lot of different young people, and this is where we're going to hope that the technology works. And I just wanted to give you an example, some of you might have already seen it, of how this plays out when we talk about media. So this is exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about.
Some parents really struggle with, like, all the other kids have the terrible things, so my kid has to. Yeah, let your kid go and be a better example to the kids. Just because the other stupid kids have phones doesn't mean that, okay, well, my kid has to be stupid, otherwise she'll feel weird.
Right.
You know, I think these things are toxic. Especially for kids. It's just this thing. It's bad, and they don't look at people when they talk to them, and they don't build empathy. You know, kids are mean, and it's because they're trying it out. They look at a kid and they go, "You're fat," and then they see the kid's face scrunch up and they go, "Ooh, that doesn't feel good to make a person do that." Right. But they got to start with doing the mean thing. But when they write "you're fat," then they just go, that was fun. I like it.
That tasted good.
Yeah, exactly. The thing is, you need to build an ability to just be yourself and not be doing something. That's what the phones are taking away.
Yes.
Is the ability to just sit there, like this. That's being a person, right?
Yes.
No one can. You gotta check, because underneath everything in your life, there's that thing, that empty, forever empty. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
I know
That knowledge that it's all for nothing and you're alone. You know, it's.
Okay. I really like this clip because it talks about everything that I'm going to be talking about in this lecture. It talks about how technologies are doing things to us, but it also really clearly, he's talking about himself. He's talking about his own fears, yeah? He's talking about how he doesn't, and I don't know anything about how he was growing up, but I don't know if he was always looking his parents in the eye and always having these really fascinating conversations, around the dinner table, the kind of ideal image of everybody sitting there having very engaged conversation, being very nice. But that is the idea. So these hopes and aspirations are part of the way in which we talk about social media, especially when it comes to young people. Because it's easy, you can talk about somebody else. So what am I going to be doing in the next, 15 minutes? I have divided this talk up in a few things, because I think we need to start out with setting kind of the baseline. What is going on? What is out there? Who are these young people that we're talking about? And that it's easy to do that around this kind of concept of the digital native. That's been bandied around, it's been used over and over again. I've written a few papers myself about what the problems are with that concept. So I'll set the scene by talking a little bit about what is it that these digital natives are? Who are they really? How can we look critically at that concept? Then I'll talk about it from the angle of one of the ways in which children are often seen, or young people are often seen when we talk about social media, and this is the perpetrators. Yeah? They share all this content that is illegal. Yeah? They lie, they cheat. And on the Conan O'Brien show, there was this kind of like children are turning into these evil young beings, and the technology is making them even worse. Kind of active, but made so by the technology. Then I'll talk about the other side of the debate. You can be in a completely different venue, a completely different room, and all of a sudden, all these poor young people have no defenses against all the terrible things that this technology does to them, social media does to them. We talk about bullying, we talk about things like grooming, where this young person all of a sudden becomes helpless. Well, in this other debate, the young person is taking this technology and really doing something terrible to other people. Then I'll end up with a bit of a contextual account. Maybe young people are just like us, embedded in our social structures, in our social relationships. Maybe, yes, the technologies are part of that, but it's not that we're either active or passive. It's just like these young people. Yeah, I now started talking about we instead of they and them. Yeah, that there's this context that we need to look at when we talk about social media. So that's a little bit of how it's going to work. So, immigrants versus natives, the age-old battle of father against son, yeah? Where this is a very technologically advanced father, I have to say, versus my son. Probably more digitally native than others. Right, so digital natives, what is this concept? Some of you might not know this, but others might, that Prensky coined this term in 2001. After that, he was very happy because it's got used a lot, but he was also very unhappy because it got taken out of context. But this was the basic idea, and Bennett, in a critical piece on his work, talks about this. That digital natives, or the net generation, yeah, these young people are said to have been immersed in technology all their lives, imbuing them with sophisticated technical skills. Now the key thing is that they say this is a generational thing, yeah? And actually Prensky did say, like anybody born after 1980 is a digital native. So that makes some of us in this room digital immigrants, and some others are going to be natives. But it was very much connected to when you were born, with a generational effect. So there's some critiques to that, yeah? To why is it important that we don't just take up that term and just assume that all young people are going to be immersed and grow up in this digital environment and know how to deal with it, and that we, importantly, as immigrants, so you now know that I was born before 1980, like that we as digital immigrants will never be able to understand or live in that world because we didn't grow up with it. Yeah, it's a generational thing. So the first critique is that it's not really age, it's not really how old you are that determines how comfortable you are communicating using social media. It's not just these young people, as if there is, the average young person and everybody else is like them. Yeah. There are a lot of different types of young people. And therefore, some of those young people might be natives, in the sense of very comfortable, and others might not be. And then there's this idea of technological exoticism or technological determinism, this idea that the technology is what makes this happen, that the technology is what is the difference between, there's kind of this exotic, this other world out there, where there's something strange happening that we don't have any control over. So I'll talk through those things very quickly. So, this is a nice graphic, but I'll talk to the graphic. So this is based on a paper that I wrote with Rebecca Einen, a colleague of mine who works at the University of Oxford, where we said, okay, let's see if it is mostly generation. Is it really age that determines how comfortable people are with different types of activities in the online environment? So we looked, and this is not social media necessarily, not all of it, but we looked at what people did, cross generations. And what we very quickly found that actually it's far more how many things you actually do online, how confident you are online, yeah, independent of when you were born. Yeah, so you could be 60 and do these things, and you would be just as engaged and comfortable in this online world. We see the same thing in social media. And especially when activities become more complex, generation becomes less and less important. So when we talk about real learning of complicated concepts, then the educational background of your parents is far more important than how old you are, or your own educational background. So we can see that generation, yes, there is a part of it, but actually more important explanatory factors are things that have to do not when you were born, but who you are and where you come from. Yeah? So this is because I will be using quite a lot of the EU Kids Online project data that I've worked on. This is a big survey where I worked on it with a lot of other people. Yeah, in all 25 European countries, 1,000 children were surveyed, plus one of their parents. So this is over 25,000 children, plus over 25,000 parents who were interviewed about the behavior of the child. And this is the model that we use to think about how do we think about young people in this online and digital environment. Yeah? And I want to use this because a lot of what we're talking about as adults, when we take that end of the victim side, is when we talk about risk factors or harm. What is it that happens to young people online that might be more negative? How do we think about the child in that context? And it's here we think about the individual child, obviously, but the individual child is embedded in social structures. There's teachers, there's parents, yeah, there's their peers, there's all these other things. And within a national context. Now, obviously, in a European study, that's nice because you've got a lot of different national contexts, but a lot of different policies, a lot of different cultural aspects. So this is how the child was envisioned. And that has to do with this kind of more structuration approach that I don't know if you are familiar with it, but Giddens is one of the big kind of theorists that think about this, where they say like, okay, yes, the individual child and where they were born and what their experiences are is important, but there is a certain limit to what they will do with the technology that is restricted by where they grew up, where they come from. And this is a kind of model, to give you where I'm coming from, that I think is very important whenever we talk about the young person and their use of technology. You need to keep all those contextual layers in account because children vary based on all those things. And we can see that in some of the results, that it is important who that individual child is and where they come from. Boys and girls differ slightly, but not as much as you might think in terms of how, if they think that they're better than their parents at using the internet, yeah? This might surprise some of you, yeah? About 1/3 of children actually doesn't think that they're much better than their parents at using the internet, which kind of goes against the idea of that digital native. They don't feel that comfortable. Their parents think they are, but they might not think so. And we can see that for young people, the youngest group, it's even worse. And we can see this is socioeconomic status, where you can see there's a big difference, statistically, at least in terms of that, in the higher socioeconomic groups, the parents are actually more skilled. Yeah, so it's especially in children from some kinds of backgrounds that these problems might arise. They might be more vulnerable online. Who are these digital natives? So who is it really that we're talking about when you ask children, when you look at children, when you study them? These are digital natives defined as children who use the internet several times per day. They're just on, they're immersed. That's the immersed part. These children who are immersed in the internet, they first went online between 7 and 10. This is all Europe, yeah? So they're older teens, boys and girls equally, often single children, more online, yeah? They are children with higher educated parents. Whether they hang out, this just probably doesn't mean that much to you, but this is kind of the more not rural and not urban, but in between suburban type children. Yeah, they have all this equipment. I'm just showing you some of these things to show you that there is amongst young people, there is a lot of variation. Because only one out of these 3 children in Europe has their own mobile phone, for example. That means that about 2/3 does not. Yeah? So what does that mean when we talk about that in terms of social media? And this is not necessarily smartphone either. So, social media. Yeah, now we're coming to social media part. All these children are online, right? All these children have social networking profiles. They're all on social media because that's what we hear all the time. Well, it turns out it's actually not so much the case. So what they do, most children do is schoolwork online, yeah? And they watch videos online, but not in a social media sense, yeah? They see a video, they go. They're not commenting, they're not contributing themselves, they're just looking at the phone and, at Louis C.K. moaning about mobile phones, but they're not participating in that sense. So they visited a social networking site, and this is once a day, about two-thirds of children. 60% send an email and using instant messaging. So it's by no means the case that all children are online and are using these. So this is another way of showing this. Let me see how that worked. I think I did this automatic. Yeah. So this is the ladder of engagement, which is called the ladder of inclusion, where at the bottom is what all children do. All children do schoolwork and playing games. Yeah. Then 86% uses the internet as a mass medium, what we were just talking about, just watching videos, not doing much themselves. 3/4 of children use it interactively for news, for communication and news, just talking to their friends. But then if we look at what we would really define as a digital native, which is all these interactive things, where we go and we interact, we contribute content, we read other people's stuff, we comment on, that's only about 1/4 of young people. So again, when we talk about what happens to young people on these really interactive platforms where they're sharing with strangers, where they're putting their own pictures up in public forum, that's not that big of a group. Okay? So I want you to keep all this in mind for what is going to come next. So who are these children that we're talking about when we talk about the more intensive use of social media? We'll start with the perpetrators. And for me, there is this debate here where people say, okay, so the medium is the message. There's these social media out there with certain characteristics, and because these media have these characteristics, children act, or young people act in a certain way. And what are we going to do? That's the technology, and we can't, in this case, they use it to bring out the worst in them in some ways. So they make young people do unacceptable things. And one of the things that we hear a lot about is how they lie, how they try to, how this anonymity online, this kind of reduced cues environments, which I think if you haven't already had this in this course, you'll probably get it. How they push young people, because in the end we're talking about young people, to challenge the existing social norms about etiquette. And to be dishonest, to do illegal activities, as in downloading videos that they haven't paid for and things like that. Yeah. So here is the reality of that. Yeah. And this was in 2001, so I think Pew has updated this a bit, but about 1/4 of online teens who use email, instant messaging, or chat spaces confess to pretending to be someone else when they emailed or instant messaged someone. Yeah? So it's 1/4. In Europe, it's slightly lower in 2010, but it's 20% or less. 1 in 8 European children has pretended to be someone they are not online. Okay. So you could say, okay, that's kind of, we don't like it when people lie about who they are because they might end up in situations, for example, a lot of what they're pretending is pretending to be older. Yeah? So they might go and sign up on a website where there's adults, which you don't necessarily want, and they might come in touch with people that they maybe shouldn't get in touch with. But can somebody tell me what you think the most common reason is why young people do this? Why young people pretend to be somebody else?
To avoid their parents.
And that's one of them, but there's a far more important reason. Yeah.
To be acceptable. To create a persona to be acceptable.
Yeah.
Accepted.
It's a little bit part of that. Anybody else? Any suggestion? Yeah.
Maybe to alter social situation to give any desire they have. For example, hurt someone's relationship, something along
Yeah,
those lines.
you're all very nice. The main reason why they do it is because they want to do what's called face raping, or they want to call, they go and break into, you create a profile, you pretend to be somebody else, then you go and post some comments on your friend's website. One of the most common uses is that young people pretend to be the girl and then they go and contact their male friends who know, the boy really likes this girl, and they send them an email and they say, oh, I was looking at you in class today, and this guy feels really happy, but then in the end the girl has no idea that that's the most common. It's to play pranks on your friends. Yeah. It's not bullying, but it's to play pranks. Some of it is to be able to sign up on social networking sites like Facebook, where the cutoff age is under 13, but actually, little secret, most of the time it's the parents that do that because they know that their child needs to be on Facebook to have a social life, so they kind of sit together and it's under supervision of the parent that this happens, which no parent will obviously ever admit to, but so these are the everyday kind of things. So it's a little bit about being accepted, it's a little bit about, playing jokes, the kind of jokes that we used to do anyway, like secret Valentines that were never really true. Okay. So the other area, so these are kind of things, common themes that we see in the media when we talk about moral panics, what happens to children. The other thing has to do with privacy or privacy. I can say privacy again, it sticks. Okay, so with the privacy, that young people just don't care anymore. They put everything up there, everything, all their personal lives, they don't care who sees it, they just don't think about it, they put it up. And they say, and the kind of idea is that this is partly the fault of social media, because social media are designed, and if you look at Joyce's work or Sullivan's work as well, they are kind of designed to share. Because if you don't share on a social medium, then the social media is going to go bankrupt, right? Because that's the whole purpose. So they're saying there's something in the design that makes young people do this. So let's look at the reality when you ask children. Okay. So in Europe, 1/4 of social networking profiles of young Europeans is public. Okay. So that's still 1 in 4. It's quite a lot. Yeah. Remember that social networking, it's not just Facebook, there's other sites as well. Yeah. More than 1/5 of US respondents, so these are young people, these are teens, who use instant messaging, email, or chat, report sharing their passwords with friends or others that they know. Yeah. So you might not have a public profile, but as soon as you share your password with somebody, well, we all know what happens because that was the previous slide. Yeah. 1 in 8 young people send personal information or photograph of themselves to people they have never met face to face. Yeah. So, right, quite shocking. It's not a lot, it's not everybody, but there's still quite a significant amount. So let's go and look at this one first. So here's an interesting thing, which is about why somebody maybe give me a suggestion about why that might be happening, why young people might be sharing their passwords.
To build trust.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go first. Yeah.
And I had to build trust with their peers or boyfriend or girlfriend, so they just want to tell them that we trust you, to build that kind of trust relationship with them.
Yeah, exactly. That's the most common reason. That you were going to say, right? No. So that's the most common reason. And it's actually, can sometimes be very problematic. We see this especially in young people who are in abusive relationships, that is like, well, you love me, right? If you love me, you're going to give me your, password. Or now, you're going to be trackable. I want to know, the location device thing. Yeah. So, but the question is, like, in the past, there used to be other means of doing this. So the technology in some ways is taking over from, for example, having your friends tell where everybody else was. It's a kind of a surveillance network that consisted of humans. Yeah? So it's not that these things didn't happen before, it's only now that we can see them more, that they're there. And I'll go to this one, I think, probably next, but when we talk about grooming as well, when it's like the people we don't know, not knowing somebody, face to face, is a very blurry concept. Yeah. Technically, I don't know any of you, but I am here, standing here with certain types of clothes and in a certain situation. I came here knowing that this was going to be the situation, so I was thinking about what I was going to wear. I'm going to come and show up in my stilettos and my miniskirt. I'll leave that for a different type of situation. But so this kind of information sharing with people you don't know tends to be contextualized. So young people do have a lot of worries. And then about the public one, yes, 1/4 is public, but these same children, young people often have a different, so actually they are quite literate in the sense that they have a different profile that's just for their friends. Because, who said it again? The parents. Yeah, the worst thing, if you want to get your child off a social networking site, friend them. Yeah? Because that's, yeah, and if they don't accept you, then that's the end of it. Although we see now change, where young people, this is the most recent research that Sonia Livingston is doing, where we see that the Facebook and all these things, like these kind of more traditional social networking profiles, platforms have become so common, so much part of our social relationships, that we now connect with everybody there, and young people are using Twitter, yeah, the messaging on Twitter, as their private platform for communication. So they're moving. So it is not really that they don't care about privacy anymore. They're just, their sense of privacy is a very immediate sense of privacy. It's a privacy, I'm gonna go to school tomorrow. So what I don't want is that the people I'm going to see at school tomorrow are gonna have any material that's going to embarrass me or going to do something to harm me. So they're thinking about that in the same way that a lot of young people 20 years ago were thinking about that. They weren't that worried about the employer in 20 years' time or the company that was trying to sell them some fizzy drink. Their privacy concerns are very immediate, very local, and that's what we see reflected online. So the question there is it the technology, is it the social medium, or are we just playing out those kinds of relationships and concerns that young people already had, like way back when? Now then the question is, there might be some problems with that, because this might be more public, so maybe then we need to, instead of saying that young people have changed, become more violent and care less about privacy, we're going to say, actually maybe these platforms need to understand that this is what young people need, and this is what young people do, and how can we make sure that young people, when they are on these platforms, are not at risk of going on sex. So now the last topic, sexting, another very popular one. And I think, did you give this to them?
I posted that on Instagram.
Perfect example of some of the things that are going on with sexting. Yeah. So the two things that we talked about before already came up a little bit. This sharing thing, yeah? You need to do it to maintain relationships, to be included. And then sometimes it goes wrong because people are evil, yeah? People have always gossiped. I think most of us will have some kind of experience of when we were in high school or when we were in, elementary, primary school, that there was some gossip going on about the girl and that she's done that. And now, basically, a lot of the same stuff is going on, only maybe one of the changes is that people are using images, which was less easy before the age of digital photography. But the kinds of stories, the kind of processes that are taking place are very much those processes that were taking place amongst young people a generation ago. It might be more visible now again. Yeah? So the argument is often that technological changes related to anonymity and these privacy violations have put pressure on young people to become more sexualized. Like, it's all out that you have to show yourself, you have to be more aware of what you look like. You are pressured into sharing these very intimate things that were never intimate before, that were never shared before. Okay. So this is what often surprises people, because there's a lot of talk about how much sexual material is out there. Yeah, this is about the definition of pornography that we used in these projects, in the EU Kids Online project. So sexting and pornography are seen by about 14%, 15% of young people in Europe. And research in the US shows that it's lower, because in some European countries, it's 20, 30%, because there's different values around pictures of naked people and sexual interactions that make it more acceptable for younger people to see this. And the other thing that happens here, so it's also culturally determined, the other thing that happens here is that there's a huge age difference. The 16-year-old versus the 9-year-old is a world apart. Yeah, when we talk about the 9-year-olds, it would maybe 3%. Yeah, the 16-year-olds, it might be closer to the 13%. And now, if you think back about that model, where I kind of waved over that bit, the big model that we use, where it's that structuration, you have to think about the context. one of the important things about that project was not only looking at the risk, because all these things are risks, yeah? You send material of yourself, it might be shared in a negative way, that could do you harm. But they are not harm. And this is why it's important that we talk to young people about their experiences with social networking. Because when you talk to those teenagers, the 16-year-olds, of whom about 1 in 3 has seen messages, almost none of them say that it was upsetting or that something bad happened. Yeah, it was a very small, it's like 1 or 2%, maybe 1%, but you get in these margins, for those of you who know about statistics, where it's really difficult, yeah.
But isn't there a difference if the naked image is like pornography, someone they don't know, versus themselves?
Yeah, there is a difference, but again, actually a lot of the sharing of themselves as well is within very intimate, trusting relationships, and sometimes, like,
But it
that
doesn't
is-
remain that way. It's very
well,
easily
but actually
shared.
it does most of the time. You share it with somebody you trust. There are cases like this one, yeah, where it goes wrong, but in general, and this is one of the things that they're saying, in general, actually it's also part kind of developing a sexual identity. So the way that they're talking about it right now, and I'm going to go to the other side of the debate soon, where we talk about the kind of more victimization, because this is all about young people doing stuff, yeah, they're actively changing. One of the things that happens is that that all of these things are really important part of a young person's development. Yeah, it's young person's developing a sexual identity, developing an individual identity as a young person, for whom peers are more and more important. Yeah? So social interaction, especially in the 13 to 16 to 18-year-olds, is fundamental to develop an individual sense of identity. These processes are going on. Developmental psychologists have talked about this for a very long time. And young people are trying to experiment with their identity, figure out who I am, where do I, what kind of thing fits best, and they can do that in this space. And so that also, the sexting, where you're sending pictures of yourself to somebody else, often takes place in that context. Now there's a problem, and this is where we need to think about context, amongst, as I already mentioned before, when you are vulnerable, when you have low self-esteem, you're lonely, and these things happen, they're more likely to go wrong. So there is a certain level of literacy that is important, but it doesn't mean that this is, for the majority of young people, it's actually a positive experience, which is very hard to understand when you're sitting here, yeah. But that's the way it is. So what we're kind of basically trying to say that these needs and desires of young people have been there, this kind of acting, and that social media fit into this. We're seeing that more and more in the research. So, and then there's the question, like, do we talk to the people who provide these technologies to make sure that those vulnerable young people don't get the negative, potentially negative effects? Social media make others do things to young people. So we talk now about the more passive. Okay. So grooming, another big thing. Yeah. Because every once in a while there's these big stories. A young person got kidnapped, or they met somebody online who was a lot older, and they ran off. And these are terrible things when they happen. And let's not pretend that they're not. They're terrible. But they are extremely rare. Extremely rare. When we talk about the moral panics, we should care about them, but we should not think that this is what happens to young people, because in general it isn't. 1 in 3 young people has made a new friend online. And 1 in 10 has then gone on to meet them offline. So these is what we would call strangers. Most of them, first of all, that was a good experience. And second of all, what we can see is that what we might define as strangers might actually not be strangers. The people that they've never met online are often friends of friends. Yeah? So there is that, and we see young people becoming more and more sophisticated in how they make these decisions. Like they might not take their parent along because that would be embarrassing, but they will take their friend along. Yeah? So there's a context to this. And we can see that even when we look just at the people that are in our networks, even amongst the people that we don't know, yeah, but it's especially true amongst the people we interact with most online, they're very similar to us. They even live in the same area most of the time. It's not like there's an online world where I interact with all these people and then there's an offline world where I have my other friends. these overlap very, very strongly, yeah, in general. Obviously, there has to be only one bad guy or woman, yeah, online who has really bad intentions for that to go wrong. But in general, these social media are extremely important for people the young people to maintain their social networks, and they're actually quite actively involved and meet people that they might not have met otherwise, but that are so similar to them that they're kind of just one step removed from their social circle. Another topic, very, very popular topic, and this is very difficult because these cases are always terrible when you hear about them. Yeah, a young person gets bullied, they get bullied, and then sometimes there's a story of suicide at the end. We've all heard those stories. It's not nice, and it's happened, bullying. But here again, I'm going to come back to this distinction between online and offline. Is it the social media that make these young people do it, or is there something else going on? So, they are an example of victimization, but very rarely is a person bullied only online. And this is extremely important to keep in mind when we talk about if you're a social worker, for example, and you're trying to do intervention, or if you're a teacher, where do you intervene? Do you need to be online to catch this? Do you need to be in this young person's cell phone to stop this from happening? Well, actually, there's only very few, who are only bullied online. So in Europe, 1 in 5, which is high, 1 in 5 young people has been bullied, in the past year. And there's a definition of bullying, you can look it up if you want to in the reports. And online, so this is both cell phones and on the internet, it's 6%. Now if you look at that 6%, almost all of these 6 are also bullied offline. So what the problem maybe is with social media is that the bullying can continue even when they're in a private space. Now that's a different story, but mostly done by people we know. And there is a very high correlation, and this is not new in research around bullying, but between being bullied and being a bully yourself. There's a lot of reciprocity there. There is, and that is something that social media might offer, because you might be in a situation where your self-esteem is being pounded to the ground. You might be online with other people that you don't know as well. You can take on the role of power. But the important thing here for me is to say the social media cannot be seen in isolation. These are again part of these processes that we already talked about. And we need to know these theories of social interaction amongst young people to understand what's going on in these social media. So now this is a little bit of a sidestep related to that paper that you had. Now something went wrong because it was a transversion of the Mac to the PC to Mac. But the other big area of concern here where we see children as victims of technology is this idea of addiction, that we can't loosen it. There's technology. We're helpless in front of technology, especially young people. They just keep playing games all day, and then they don't eat, and they don't sleep, and they don't drink. And what are we going to do? The only thing that we can do is take them off the technology. Well, with all the things that I've been telling you before about how especially that social interaction is very important, and taking them off might actually isolate them in certain ways, you might want to think about that in a slightly different way, and think about who is most at risk of having these negative outcomes of very intense use. So the statements tend to be that internet use can be pathological and is the quality of social life, even though most of what young people do online is schoolwork, talking to friends, so there's a bit of a contradiction there. But it's a very delicate balance there between optimal and maximum use, And this is the key thing. What that is going to differ depending on who that child is. Because a child is not a child, is not a child, all children are different, and we need to understand that context. So what often the theory is around all these things that we've been talking about, the perpetrator, or the child is perpetrator, or the child is victim of technology, put the technology here, and that for social life and personality changes, and young people start doing all these things. But when we look at it in a slightly different model, we can see that personality, or who the child is and where they come from, often influences how they use the technology. or what the technology does to them, and that influences their life. So it's a cycle. We have to think about that in that context. So this is where I'm going to spend the last few minutes of this talk, or 10 minutes of this talk, talking about, which is, so to what extent anybody is innocent, let's leave that up for discussion, but young people are sometimes thought of as these innocent young beings. Can we think about it in a way that we are, that it's not the technology coming in and doing something to us, but where we are bystanders in the sense that we are part of a society, technology comes and is part of that. Does it amplify processes? Does it kind of lift some processes up and make them more visible, as what we've been talking about before? So to move away a little bit from that techno-determinist perspective that says that technology comes into these lives of these young people, which is often the way that the discourse is held in the media and elsewhere, and think about what is it that our social lives, who we are, where we come from, how that influences what we do. Now, the completely social constructivist perspective, it says that technology can be shaped and molded to our heart's desire. I wouldn't take that extreme position. Let's say we're somewhere in between. So to do that, I'm going to go back to giving a bit of background. And this is the other area of my research. This is the book I'm writing on, so I can't help it but put it in another presentation because it's in front of my mind. But one of the things that we know is that access to certain types of technology, not just to social media, but different types of access to these social media and technologies, and the skills, is very strongly related to traditional exclusion factors. So how literate you are, how high the quality of your access or engagement is with the technology depends on where you come from. It's the strongest predictor over generation or age or whether you're young. And that these two, access and skills, are the greatest barriers to equality of opportunity in mediated communication. So we're not talking about everybody has to do the same things on social media. Yeah, this is not like, pardon my language, a communist state online where everybody has to be the same, but it is about people having the same opportunities to a meaningful, positive engagement with the technology. Now, what is this situation? So this is the world. This is just the internet. So let's not forget that we live in a global world. The internet now supposedly reaches everywhere. And what we can see, we're here right now. Yeah? In the US, between 75% and 100% of people are online. They use the internet, however vaguely you want to define it. Yeah? In Europe, it's slightly lower. It might surprise you. Yeah? On average in Europe, less than 3/4 of the population is online. South America, yeah, even lower. These red areas, less than 20% of the people are online. So knowing this is just about the internet, and going back to this idea of young people as engaged with technologies and the type of access that they might have to these social media, and therefore how literate they might be. How, if we just talk about young people, and we take a definition, which is the official definition now used by the ITU, of a digital native as somebody who's been online for at least 5 years and uses the internet on a weekly basis at least. How many of the world's population of young people do you think is actually engaged with the internet in that sense? Somebody give me a number, a percentage. 40? Yeah? Does anybody want to go higher? No? Lower, anybody? Higher?
Say 65.
65? So we got 40, we got 65. Anybody want to offer something else? 7? Okay. That's not that bad. Okay. So it's only 30%, yeah, of the world's youth population, defined as between 15 and 24, has been active online for at least 5 years and is still actively engaged. So these are the kind of young people that are actively online. Now then amongst those people who are actively online, so we're now going to go to just the people who are actively online and see how that might work out for social networking. So this is in Europe, where we just saw, in terms of young people, it's between the 75 and 100% of young people are online in this country. This is based on the EU Kids Online study, where we made a classification of young people in Europe based on the opportunities that they took up. Yeah, we had a list of questions about You know, do you create content online? Do you do your schoolwork online? All those questions that we saw before. Like, do you look up the news? Do you learn things online? All these kinds of questions. Way more complicated than that. That was one aspect of it. The second aspect of it was the risks that they ran and the harm that they had from that. So not just did you go and meet somebody offline that you met online, but was that a negative experience? And the third aspect of it was parental mediation. How involved were parents in their internet use? Now, most of the risks that we looked at were related to social media. Sexting, bullying, meeting people offline, and pornography, which is technically tends to not be social media, but it tends to be a lot of videos and images, so they tend to be on social media platforms. So those are the 4 risks that concern policymakers most. These were. So what you can see is that where you come from determines quite a lot, to a significant extent, on what your everyday experience with the internet is going to be. So we can see, for example, and if anybody knows Europe, it wouldn't surprise you, that the Scandinavian countries, which are up here, and that's Denmark and the Netherlands, they fall into this cluster called the supported risky explorers. This is countries in which young people take a lot of risks. They do a lot of sexting, for example. Again, I said if you know anything about Europe, it's not going to surprise you. Yeah, they do a lot of sexting, they see a lot of pornography, but they experience relatively little harm for that. And on top of that, they have parents who are quite actively involved in their internet use. Not technically in terms of like they're blocking their sites, no. They talk to them about what is going on. They have, if something happens, they're there for their child, those kinds of things. They also take up a lot of opportunities. Yeah, they do a lot of different things online. So this is kind of risk-taking, but in a safe environment because there's no negative. Now, the kind of opposite of that would be this block of this kind of dark, I think it's supposed to be dark red, but burgundy, I'm not very color literate, of countries where young people actually, they don't run many risks. Nice, right? They don't run any risks. Their parents are very restrictive, so they're involved in a very restrictive sense, in the sense that you are not allowed to go online, you're not allowed to have a social networking site, a profile, all these kinds of things. But at the same time, these children take up very few of the opportunities. So they might do schoolwork and reading the news. Now, this is a big area of debate, because great, the kids are not taking any risks, they're just doing their schoolwork, and we can keep them offline and we can keep them under control. The problem is that these children have a lot of problems in terms of when they come out later and they have to hook up in this world that's social, yeah, and where employers, for example, but also future social contexts, relying on the technology, but they will not have the experience, yeah, not that risk-taking with the support that the other children have. So we don't see this necessarily as an ideal situation. The fact that you don't do anything online and therefore don't get hurt is also not an ideal situation. Now, and then there's other countries where this is the most problematic group. These are people who do a lot of things. They do a lot of social networking, a lot of interactions. They have actually quite a bit of harm, but there's no support for them. Yeah, the parents are not involved. There's very little regulation. Yeah, so things like that. So you can see, I just wanted to illustrate that where a child lives and where they come from is going to determine a lot what kind of impact or what kind of experience they have with these social media. Another environment that's very important to keep in mind when we think about how children might engage with social media, young people, is the school environment. And in the US, it's even more complicated because schools have a lot more independence. In Europe and in other countries, they tend to be more centrally organized, where there's more central coordination and governance of schools, of what they have to do and how they have to deal with it. But so what happens in the US is that head teachers or teachers in the classroom have a lot more freedom to decide. Good, nice for the autonomy of the teachers, but sometimes not so good, because what happens is that there's going to be more inequality. And one of the things that we can see is that teachers of the lowest income students are more than twice as likely as teachers of the highest income students to say that students lack access to digital technology, and that it's a major challenge in incorporating digital tools into their teaching. So these are the young people that are not on a daily basis. The school environment is often the environment that they find themselves in most. As after school programs, they are there. That is where they live a lot of the times. They don't have any exposure to technology, either because they don't have access, or they have access to the technology in an environment that's less supportive. And when we think about social media and the things that we've been talking about, sexting, bullying, all these kinds of things, one of the most important ways to prevent that from becoming a harmful experience is to make sure that the child is in an environment where if something happens that they're uncomfortable with, they know that they can go and talk to somebody, yeah? Whether it's a teacher or the peer. And the other layer that, if you read Purcell's paper, the other layer that comes on top of that is that these lowest income students often also come from environments where their parents are even less comfortable with technology. I really don't feel that they can talk to these young people about what is going on. Yeah. So, school environment is one. And then there's two more things that I wanted to say before wrapping up. Family environment, I just hinted at it. Yeah. Where you live, who your parents are, your siblings, all that stuff, is a very important environment for how we use technologies. And where we can see is that when we go back to that debate about the digital native and how young people know how to handle themselves online, or they just feel comfortable, they just put stuff online because they think it's like their home, and they have no more sense of privacy, or they're sharing, they don't see that context, is that is very much stratified by the background of their parents. Yeah. And then we're not talking just about the socio-demographic, kind of social, economic background. We're not talking about just that. We're not talking about just culture or resources. But we're also talking about the access that the parents have themselves and the skills that the parents have themselves in a digital sense. Those all influence directly what the child does and how they can cope with some situations that might be risky and make sure that they don't turn into harm. So again, and the interesting thing that we found when we did this is also based on a paper that we did with that I wrote with Rebecca Einen, is that we find that who the parent is influences what the child does, but the characteristics of the child influence very little what the parent does. And that is interesting if you think about a wider debate in which children or young people are seen as those who are going to make sure that all these adults become digitally literate. Yeah? So it's really about who the parent is and where they come from more than that influences what the child does more than the other. So this is the last point, if I believe, and this is based on the paper. And in the paper, the reason I proposed that this would be the paper, the reading, was because I thought it combined almost all these things that we've been talking about. Yeah, it combines about this kind of panic, this idea of where you come from, but also how the same type of skill, in this case, what we're talking about, can have a different impact depending on who the child is. And what we can see, this is a graph that was in that paper but slightly changed, where we can see here that children with a lot of emotional problems, when we teach them digital skills, they have more negative outcomes of the internet use than for those children who have very low emotional problems. Now these are trends, these are based on regressions, and if you look at the raw data, it goes a bit more like this. So the impact of getting more digital skills, getting more immersed in that digital environment, doesn't have that great of a negative effect on young people with low, okay, it's the last slide anyway. Yeah, so we need to know that then this is important for educators, for parents, for government, for anybody who works with young people and is concerned about what these social media, what kind of role they might have in young people's lives, is that you need to understand the context of that individual child. And that the intervention, or the place where you might do something to prevent that harm from happening, is by recognizing early enough that that's a young person who comes from a vulnerable background, and that you need to work with those young child, because you don't want to say, we're not going to teach you how to use the internet, because really in this digital world, that's become kind of impossible, yeah, to disconnect. So how can we make sure that these young people use the technology? So when studying youth and social media, the following should be kept in mind. This is what I think. you can have your own opinion on what to add to this list. Yeah. So there is a tendency towards moral panics where we base our theorization, our ideas on anecdotes, on our own experiences, which are very intimate and very powerful. But let's see what actually happens in the lives of young people to be able to support them better in their use. A tendency towards an alienation of youth, the construction of childhood as these young people who are living in this world that we don't know, and they're doing all these things, and I have no idea who my child is anymore. A tendency towards techno-determinism, to saying that technology does something to young people, therefore they start acting badly because the technology is there, or they become victimized because the technology is there. And a tendency to separate the offline and the online. Bullying is a very clear case of this, where you cannot look at online bullying without really understanding that this is part of an offline pattern, and that those children who are bullied online are also the ones who have a really hard time offline. And a decontextualization of social media, in the sense of not thinking about how they are embedded in all these processes and the everyday life that we already know. Yeah, so that's kind of how I built it, from anecdotes to really taking that more overview picture, the more kind of a broader idea of how we can look at young people in social media as part of the world that we now live in, and all the influences that look at, or that kind of pound upon these young people who are just trying to grow up and be happy. Yeah? Okay, so that was it. Thank you.
Thank you.